where do you think things stand for them? Are they in danger now of losing the next election, whether it comes in a year or 2 years' time, or do you think that they can turn things around?
I think the election will be in 2 years' time, and I've thought that for a long time anyway. I don't think it'll be next year. And the state of the polls at the moment, which are so dire for the Tory party, mean that there's no chance there'll be an election next year. Whether they can win it in 2 years' time, or whether the gap becomes concreted into the system, into voters' minds, the next few weeks particularly will show. But I think it's not just a response to the budget that we've seen this, it's a response to the last few months where the Conservative Party has not actually been governing. They've had all sorts of problems. We've had all sorts of problems with Boris Johnson, votes of confidence, removing him as leader, and then the hustings. So it's an accumulation of matters rather than any one issue.
Yeah, Kieran, I wanted to ask you about that because there are some who suggest it's all off the back of this mini-budget and the subsequent reaction of the markets, but that can't quite be true, can it? What do you think are the main drivers behind what's happening for the Conservatives and crucially for Labour? You know, is this a Keir Starmer conference bounce, or is it just because people think the Tories are doing so badly that they are turning to Labour by default?
So on the first point, the context of this, the poll leads that we're seeing at the moment is that Liz Truss inherited a pretty bad situation from the get-go where the public weren't confident in Boris Johnson, in how his government were handling the cost of living and also public services and so on. And you know, very much what pollsters like me were looking to see is whether Liz Truss could turn that around with a honeymoon period. But obviously the opposite seems to have happened. You only get one chance to make a first impression. And this last week we've seen 80% think the economy is in a poor state, 6 in 10 think Kwasi Kwarteng's made it worse, and 2/3 do not have confidence in the Conservatives' long-term economic plan. So really difficult numbers. Then on the flip side with Labour, you're seeing a growing sense in the public that they think Keir Starmer might indeed be Prime Minister one day. So one final stat I'll throw at you, 51% told us this week they think it's likely that Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister in the future. 35% said it would be unlikely. Back in January, we saw those numbers essentially flipped. So you've got almost a pincer movement where people are lacking confidence in the Conservatives and also starting to take Labour more seriously as a genuine party of government.
And Robert, is this just the political cycle that we often see? You know, the Conservatives have been in power for a long time now. There has been a sense, even over the summer during the leadership campaign, that maybe the party has run out of new ideas and fresh thinking. Is this just kind of what happens with electorates, that they get tired of one government and they put the next lot in instead?
I think there is a risk of that. That's always the case with any government that's in for a period of time. But we've had different styles of government, different styles of Prime Minister. But I think, taking on what Kieran's just said, I don't get the impression, and I don't think the polls show that people are actually in love with the Labour Party. People are beginning to recognise that Keir Starmer may well be the next Prime Minister. But what they're actually saying is the Tories have got themselves in such a mess by a series of different events that unless they change course, this is where we're going to be in terms of voting intentions at the next election.
And Robert, does that mean then that if the Conservatives, and I say this quietly almost, if the Conservatives were to decide that they were really fed up with Liz Truss and that they wanted to have a new leader and they somehow engineered that to happen, that they could turn this around with somebody else that could maybe inspire confidence if that Labour support is not particularly strong?
No, I think the Conservative Party, if they're going to win the next election, they've got to ensure that the Liz Truss government gets the message across of what it's trying to do, that it is actually achieving things. There may be things which have particularly offended voters which they'll want to change. But I'm afraid if the Tory party got into the mood to have another leader, I think the electorate would say you're having a laugh.
Now, Kieran, let's just look at precedents on this. You had that massive poll this week, a 17-point lead for Labour, followed by a 33-point lead in another poll. If we look back at similar shocks, if you like, in the polls, Black Wednesday would be an obvious example in 1992, can parties recover from this sort of deficit?
So I think the short answer is it's very difficult. Yes, it's possible, but it's extremely difficult. So, I mean, Probably a good example is the era of David Cameron and George Osborne, and sort of post the so-called omni-shambles budget. I mean, not quite the same, but an example of where a budget was sort of unwound and was negatively received. The opposition was ahead, sort of mid-parliament, and then of course David Cameron goes on to win a majority. But if you look at leader ratings over time, it's certainly true that prime ministers tend to finish with worse ratings than they start. I don't think that'll be any surprise to anybody. But during the lifetime of their premierships, they can ebb and flow. So I was just recently, before coming on air, looking at Tony Blair's ratings, and actually his personal ratings plummeted around the time of the sort of petrol crisis in 2000, but then subsequently recovered around 9/11 and the war on terror and so on, pre-Iraq. So events happen, and these ratings do ebb and flow. But I think the problem for the Conservatives is one of their historically core brand strengths, if I can use that terminology, is that they're seen as the party of sound money and sound economic management. And what we tend to find in the past is once that reputation is lost, it's very, very difficult to get it back. And sometimes it takes as many as not just one term, but 2 or 3 terms for that to happen. And indeed, you need the government that then comes in to lose theirs for people to even listen to in the first place. So these are really trying times for the Conservatives, and they really need to get a grip of where the economy is going and what the public think of it. Otherwise, it is going to be a very difficult general election, as Lord Hayward says.
What do you think, Lord Hayward? I'm just looking at another opinion poll. Every single issue, the economy, defence, foreign affairs, immigration, Observer gives Labour ahead on all of those. Can the Tories recover from this sort of deficit?
I think they can, and as Kieran's just said, but it's going to be a gargantuan task. And it's not just getting the message across about what Liz Truss, I'm using the term we in relation to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, what they are trying to do. It's not just a messaging. There are 2 issues. One is the public reaction to the abolition of an upper rate tax while talking about cutting welfare benefits has gone down appallingly badly. So they have to deal with the public opinion approach while at the same time dealing with the market's reaction. You can recover, but you're fighting fires on different fronts and need to adjust different things to achieve the results.
Robert Hayward, before we let you go, can I just ask you on a personal note? You are a Conservative peer. How do you feel about what's happening right now? Do you feel comfortable about where the party is?
Kate, I always try and look at this as an analyst rather than what my own personal view is, because if I start saying, well, this is my personal view, your listeners and viewers will start saying, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? I do have views, but I'm going to keep them to myself.
You're coming to Birmingham?
No, I'm not, but I haven't been for several years. And I think unseen, actually, although there may be more people not there this year, unseen, the attendance by Tory MPs at conferences has dropped off very markedly in recent years. It's not something specifically that relates to this year.